Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's talk with Dmitri Alperovitch about his new book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Before we begin, I just want to say that if anyone came here with any questions, there will be time at the end for Dmitri to answer those questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat and we can get to them later, or wait for the end to ask those questions. So for the few of you who may not know Dmitri, Dmitri is the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership. He's the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike. Dmitri has served as special advisor to the Department of Defense and currently serves on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Cyber Safety Review Board. His writings on geopolitics, foreign policy, and cybersecurity issues have appeared in major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. He has been named one of Fortune magazine's 40 under 40 most influential young people in business, and Politico magazine has featured Alperovitch as one of Politico 50 influential thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. Dmitri, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Christian. Great to be with you.
So you've written a fascinating book called World on the Brink. Recommend everyone take a look. But before we get in there, I actually want to start off with a little bit of your history to kind of paint the picture of how you got interested in this. So can you talk a little bit about Operation Aurora, what it was, and how that got you to pay closer attention to this topic?
Yeah, so Aurora was a hack of about 24 companies, most prominently Google, by China. It was the first time when the broader public realized that the threat actors that you encounter in cyberspace on a regular basis were not just criminals, were not just hacktivists, people interested in defacing your website or leaking your emails or stealing your credit cards, but they were nation states that were after something very different: intellectual property, trade secrets, source code, those types of things that could be helpful to your competitors in countries like Russia and China and elsewhere, that would be used to effectively build better products, competing products, have a better go-to-market strategy and the like. And I was running threat research operations at McAfee at the time in 2010. In January of 2010, when I got a call from Google, who had discovered a month earlier that their network had been infiltrated by an unknown actor. And in the process of their investigation, as they were sort of figuring out the command and control infrastructure and other indicators of compromise related to the hack, they realized that there were many other victims, and many of them they realized were actually customers of McAfee. So they reached out to us to cooperate on that investigation, and ultimately I named it Operation Aurora. Google had done the early attribution work on that investigation, attributing it to China, and specifically the government of China, Chinese intelligence services, and came out publicly, I think about a week later, unveiling that operation. And it was a groundbreaking event because U.S. government was starting to get focused on it. Industry realized that there was this thing called APT, at the time an unknown term, advanced persistent threat, which was really at the time a euphemism for China. Since then, became kind of much broader term used to characterize most nation state threats. But this, I think, transformed cybersecurity because you realize that the old model of doing business, which is that your network had to be not a perfect network in terms of security, but simply good enough, perhaps better than your competitors, so that an attacker who is not persistent, who is not interested in just your data, would simply move on because it takes too much effort to infiltrate your network. And if someone has a much weaker level of security, they would redirect their efforts after them. Sort of the old adage, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the person running next to you. That doesn't work. That breaks down with this persistent attacker model, because what they're interested in is not your competitor's data, but your data. because of what you have that no one else has. So if the bear really wants you, it doesn't matter who else is running.
Sure. Or the panda in this case. So can you
Little bear.
outline
Little bear.
yeah. So can you outline the historic relationship between Taiwan and China, and where that relationship sits today?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do in the book is really describe the history of both Taiwan and the history of its relationship with China, because I think most people, even people that have spent a lot of time on this issue, do not appreciate that there's never been a single moment in history when Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, fully belonged to China, to whoever fully controlled China. Not 1 year, not 1 month, not 1 day. Right? This is Chinese propaganda that needs to be debunked. There have been numerous attempts to colonize Taiwan over its history. First of all, the indigenous population of Taiwan is not even Han Chinese; it's Micronesians, right? That arrived on the island many, many centuries ago. And there have been attempts by the Dutch, there have been attempts by the Spanish, and then ultimately the first successful attempt to fully control the island was by the Japanese in the 1890s when they had conquered the place, mostly because the tribes, the native tribes on the island, were very warlike and would periodically kill shipwrecked crews of ships that would crash on the island. And eventually the Japanese got tired of it and decided to occupy it fully. There's actually a fascinating moment that I highlighted during the launch of my book here in Washington, D.C., at a bookstore called Politics and Prose, where you have these types of books usually get launched. I did a fireside chat with Jim Sciutto of CNN. And after the fireside chat, we took questions from the audience, and this woman came up to the microphone and introduced herself as the first secretary from the Chinese embassy.
Oh,
And she laid into me on how Taiwan has always belonged to China and all this propaganda. And I said, let me just stop you right there, and perhaps educate you on something you may not have learned in your Chinese Communist Party schooling. And that is the episode in 1867 when an American merchant marine ship, the Rover, shipwrecks on the island of Taiwan. The crew disembarks on the island and gets slaughtered by the native tribesmen. And as you might expect, the United States, Washington, files a formal protest to the Chinese emperor, who ostensibly on paper controls Taiwan, even though they don't have really the de facto control of the island. And the response comes back from the emperor's court saying that we don't control these savages. You're welcome to do whatever you want with them. Right. So basically self-admitting that they don't have control. The same thing was happening to the Japanese. So in the 1890s, they finally conquered that island and held control until 1945 and the end of World War II, when the Allies forced it to give it back, or give it, I should say, not back, but give it to China. Um, of course, the person that they were giving it to was Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of China, who was already not really in control of China because he was fighting the civil war with Mao that he was steadily losing. And ultimately, in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek flees with about 2 million of his nationalist forces to Taiwan, establishes a brutal dictatorship on the island that lasts until the 1980s, and then Taiwan transitions into a democratic system that we have today. But there has never been one moment when the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, controlled Taiwan in any way, or anyone that really had full control of China itself, fully controlled Taiwan. And what's also interesting is I write in the book, because we looked at a lot of documents from the early Chinese era, including some of the documents that have recently been, until recently, had been classified in China through a friend of mine, a historian. We were able to get access to some of them. What's interesting is Mao's attitudes on Taiwan. In fact,
mm,
before Chiang Kai-shek flees to the island, the importance of Taiwan in Chinese minds was not so great. And Mao is actually quoted in the 1930s saying that we don't really think that Taiwan belongs to China. This is not consequential for us. But all of that changes when his arch enemy is not defeated, right? That the civil war does not really end because he's able to flee and not just flee, but establish a rival China, because Chiang Kai-shek, right after fleeing, proclaims Taiwan to be the Republic of China, the successor to effectively the Republic of China that he tried to rule over uh, before the Civil War, and actually proclaims it to be the China. So in the international arena until the 1970s, everyone recognized the Republic of China, Taiwan, as the China, ignoring the mainland. So in the UN National Security Council, Taiwan held a seat of China. It had the relationships with countries of like the United States and Europe and others, and there were no relationship. There was no diplomatic relationship with the PRC until 1970s and the detente, the opening of China by Nixon. So this had become much more important to the Chinese psyche and particularly to the Communist Party, that you had to vanquish this rival China, you had to finish the Civil War that was unfinished business. And then as the confrontation with the United States escalated, this became even more important because Taiwan was viewed as the anchor point of this first island chain, so-called first island chain that runs from the Japanese islands through Taiwan down to the Philippines, that from the Chinese perspective is viewed as the United States' attempt to contain China and encircle them. So to break out of that containment and encirclement, Taiwan becomes very, very critical for those geopolitical reasons. So that's a really, really brief history. There's a lot more on this in the book, but give you a sense how the perception of Taiwan has changed in mainland China and why it's become so important today. And just the other day, literally, I think yesterday or October 1st, Xi Jinping, in a banquet celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, proclaimed that Taiwan is China's sacred territory, the
Mm.
blood is thicker than water, and people on both sides of the strait are connected by blood, which is really interesting because it reminds me of another authoritarian leader that talked about bloodlines and being connected by blood to
Sure.
Germanic people.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. But on that note, so you talk about how I think you say that 7% of Taiwanese people are in favor of unification with China, and I think you say like 1% is in favor with unification immediately. Do you have an estimation of what those numbers are on the Chinese side for what Chinese citizens, if they want unification with Taiwan?
So, there's no reliable polling in China, of course, but, these people have been brainwashed from their early school upbringing
Yeah,
that Taiwan belongs to China. So I think, if you were to do an independent polling of the country, you'd probably have most of the population saying, yes, we should have Taiwan. Whether they'd be interested in sacrificing their life or their children's life for the island, I think is a totally different matter. And I think most of them would not want war over Taiwan, or sacrifice their economic well-being over it. So, in that sense, I think it's not unlike Russia, where if you had asked a typical Russian pre 2014, do you think Ukraine is an independent country? Do you think it belongs to Russia? The reflexive answer that, of course, had been beaten into them through the Soviet era is yes, of course. But if you had followed up with, do you want to fight for Ukraine? The majority would probably say no, right? So I think you'd probably have a similar situation in China.
interesting. Yeah, I was curious about those similarities. So speaking of that, so during Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you talked about kind of five key motivations uh, and how those motivations led you to believe the same thing about the potential actions of Xi coming up. Can you talk about those different motivations and kind of discuss each one and why they lead to your conviction in this?
Yeah, so as you know, Christian, I was one of the first geopolitical analysts to call it, that Putin was going to invade Ukraine about almost 3 months before it actually took place. And as I was doing my retrospective on that when the war began, which I'll just tell you a personal story. I was convinced, just absolutely convinced, that the war would begin that week. I was actually in Munich at Munich Security Conference, which is this confab of defense secretaries, prime ministers, etc., at this hotel. in Munich that I've been going to for about a dozen years, and it was on the weekend of February 18th, 19th. It's always the mid weekend in February, and Zelensky was actually going to fly in, and he did. And I was convinced that Putin was going to start the war when Zelensky's in Munich, right? In retrospect, it probably would have been a smart thing for him to do,
Yeah.
given how Zelensky was able to mobilize the world and the Ukrainian population to
Yeah.
fight this war. Would have been much, much harder had he been exiled and not being able to get back into the country. But he waited and did it a little bit later in that week. But I was convinced it was going to happen. And yet, when on Wednesday night Eastern time, as I was watching Telegram channels and getting reports from people in Ukraine that I knew that this was unfolding, I think around 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock Eastern time, early morning hours in Ukraine, I was still shocked. Just like when you expect something to happen, but when it actually does happen, you're still like, oh my God, I can't believe this actually did happen.
Sure.
Because it went from being sort of a theoretical, yeah, war is coming, to being very real, and places I knew and people I know being impacted in a very dire way. And as I was spending the next day kind of closely tracking the conflict, but also sort of recovering from my shock and anger and frustrations, I was doing a retrospective on how did we actually end up here and what were the causes of that conflict. I started sort of writing down Putin's um, thought process, or as I viewed his likely thought process, and I came up with this list of five core drivers that I think pushed him to do this. And by the way, I'm not justifying this in any way. This is an illegal, horrendous, genocidal war, but it's important to understand how our adversaries think.
Yeah.
And the drivers are really history, and you've seen over the last couple of years in particular his over focus on history and the distorted view of history, um, uh, with the perception of Ukraine as not an independent state and so forth, and belonging to Russia. This, in his view, destiny. He talks a lot about his personal destiny. He talks a lot about his country's destiny to take Ukraine, and then security and geography, right? There's a lot of conversations around NATO expansion and whether NATO expansion triggered this conflict. My view is that it was not the sole trigger, but it's also incorrect to say that it had absolutely nothing to do with it, because there is a fear that you've had Russians really express over centuries of potential invasions from Europe,
Yeah.
where you've had Hitler, Napoleon, Teutonic Knights, the Poles, you name it, all have traversed either Ukraine or Belarus on their way to Moscow to invade Russia. So having that buffer state of Ukraine and Belarus has always been very, very important to Russian strategy. It's not to excuse invasion in any way, but this is how they think, right? So that geography, security is important. And the last element, uh, the driver that I think is really key and really explains the timing, right? Putin has been in power by the time of the invasion for almost 23 years, right? Why now is a question that many asked. And I think because he had been in power for 23 years, because he had just turned 70, that was the why now, because he's driven by ego. He is driven by the desire to establish a legacy. He talks a lot about his admiration for Peter the great Tsar of Russia that expanded the Russian Empire, established the city of St. Petersburg, where incidentally Putin was born, back when it was named Leningrad. And it wasn't enough for him to be satisfied with, well, one day maybe we bring Ukraine back into Russian hands, right? It had to happen under his watch so he could get credit for it. And that was the why now, and that was, I think, the overarching driver for him wanting to do this. Looking at his own mortality, there's been a lot of writing about how he was very impacted by COVID, paranoid about getting sick, right? The long table memes and
Yeah.
uh, 2-week quarantines before anyone could see him, and so forth. Very much afraid of dying, and thinking about his mortality a lot. And as I wrote all these factors down, I realized, my gosh, every single one of those applies to Xi, right? His distorted view of history, believing that Taiwan belongs to China, his view of Taiwan as being critical to security and geography of China, his view of his personal and Chinese destiny to take Taiwan that he talks about openly, and lastly, his ego. And by the way, it's not an accident. At this moment in time, both these men are in their 70s, right? And that looking at sort of the next decade as a twilight of their careers, their potentially even lives, maybe, and wanting to go down into the history books as great leaders that did something, in their view, as magnificent for their countries. And she, we know, we can see this, is obsessed with eclipsing Mao's legacy,
Mm.
being the person that did the one thing that Mao could never do, which was take Taiwan.
And how much of that obsession do you think stems from the banishment of his family when he was a child? Is that quite a big portion of it, you think?
It could be, you're referring to, of course, the Cultural Revolution when his father was purged. He was sent into the countryside, had to do a lot of
Yeah.
hard labor. Um, I think clearly was very much a formative experience for him. And in many ways, him getting to the top of the Communist Party hierarchy and the leadership of China itself is a revenge move, right? I showed you that you think you can banish me because he was a princeling, right? His father was a high level official in the Communist Party, was purged, and he lost all of those privileges, and he made it all the way back, right, to the very top.
Yeah.
So I think that is a key driver for him and motivator, and being able to go even further and show them by doing something that even Mao couldn't do, I think is important to him.
Interesting. And just curious, when you were took that kind of retrospective look and you looked at those five key motivations, was that the moment you decided to write the book?
It was. It was. I started writing. Well, there had to be a conversation with my co-author Garrett about doing it, and then doing the publisher selection and so forth. But basically, we got started right after the war began.
Interesting. So you talk a lot about how Taiwan is and always has been a natural fortress. It's extremely tough to invade, and you actually open the book with a fictional, hopefully fictional wartime scenario of what a Chinese invasion would look like. Even give a date of November 13th, 2028. I know that's not an exact, hey, look out for this date, but it's a
Even
helpful.
the time, 6 a.m., I believe, right? So,
There you go.
like the
Yeah,
calendars.
yeah, I'll text you at 7 a.m. and let you know. Um, so, and by the way, that I wasn't in the military, but reading that was really palatable and easy for someone who doesn't really read that kind of stuff. So, credit to you and thanks for writing it in that way. Um, but can you talk a little bit about why is Taiwan that fortress, and also why that date?
Yeah. So a lot of people have this, to the extent they even think about Taiwan and potential invasion scenarios of Taiwan, have this kind of simplistic view that this would be like Normandy, D-Day, right? Higgins boats landing on the beaches and,
Mhm.
moving on to capture Paris or, Taipei from there. And that is just not the reality of this terrain, right? And I spent a lot of time last year when I was in Taiwan. A lot of people that go to Taiwan, visit Taipei, visit the TSMC fabs in the southern part of the country. But I actually took time to do something that people don't usually do, which is drive around the island, get a sense for the terrain, get a sense for potential landing spots of, if I'm China, how would I invade this place? I did this with a very good friend of mine, Ivan Kanapathy, who was the U.S. military attaché to Taiwan, a Marine fighter pilot, was in the White House and national security staff afterwards. Really phenomenal guy, and we literally sort of gameplayed this as we're looking at the different beaches, different facilities of, if you're China, where would you go? How would you do this? And you just realize the enormity of this task. It is so difficult. So first of all, you have to cross the Taiwan Strait, which is about the size of the English Channel in terms of its width, but much, much rougher waters. Taiwan Strait, basically half the year, is all but impassable to anything but huge container ships. The waters get very rough. It gets very foggy, stormy weather. You got typhoons. You got other weather effects, basically year round. There are a few times when it gets a little bit more clear, but really, really unpredictable. So once you cross, if you're going to land on the beaches, sort of a repeat of D-Day, here's the problems you face. The waters are very shallow. As I mentioned already, very rough.
Mm.
And one of the things that people forget with D-Day is that it wasn't just landing on the beaches and taking the German fortifications. The way you win wars or battles is logistics, right? It's not weapon systems, it's not Wunderwaffe. It is logistics, munitions, food, and other supplies that you need to fuel, that you need to provide to your forces, right? And the way that the United States and the Allies did it on D-Day is they set up these Mulberry ports, right? These floating, huge floating docks that allowed them to bring in the armor, the fuel, and all those logistics. If you didn't have that, this invasion would have failed. And the problem is that you can't do that in Taiwan Strait. The waters are too rough. And just to illustrate that point, some of you may remember that back this spring, the United States, in its effort to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza, set up a floating dock structure to bring in aid into that territory. It lasted all of about 5 days and had to be scrapped because of rough sea weather. Well, the Mediterranean is a lake compared to the Taiwan Strait. So if you can't do it in the Mediterranean,
Yeah.
there's no way that you can actually do this in the Taiwan Strait, right? And then even if you somehow could do it, the beaches themselves are very, very small. Um, they're surrounded by mountains and hills. So that means that they can be fire controlled. You can set up artillery to hammer positions on the beaches, even if you somehow manage to get to them. And two, in many cases, you land on the beach and you're up against a mountain. There's nowhere to go, right? So this is not sort of the rolling fields of Normandy where you can just drive on. And then if you can somehow get over the mountains, there's rivers, there's tunnels inside the mountains. There's lots of very uh, capable natural fortifications that could be used by a force that is protecting you. So one of the things I did in the research for this book is I actually looked at invasion plans for this island from 1944,
Mm.
because the last time that someone wanted to invade this island was actually the United States. In 1944, right after the success of D-Day, Taiwan was, of course, at the time a Japanese colony. There were about 60,000 Japanese forces on that island, about 6 million Taiwanese. Today, it's 24 million Taiwanese, about 100,000 um, permanent active duty members of the military and the Taiwanese armed forces, and about a million reservists, although their training quality is quite questionable, but nevertheless, it's a huge force compared to what the Japanese had in 1944, right? And 2 months after D-Day, literally in August of 1944, the Joint Staff puts together this invasion plan of Taiwan. And what do they do? Do they just do a repeat of Normandy? No. They don't look at the beaches at all, because even back in 1944, they realized this is too hard. And they focus on the ports. And in fact, the main port at the time was the port in the south, on the southern tip of the island. And they were going to try to take that port, and if successful, push north, and try to take the city of Taipei. They estimated it would be a 2 month long campaign. They would suffer 45,000 casualties in their estimation. And just to compare it, D-Day, we took 2,500 KIAs on that day, right? This is 45,000. Um, and it was ultimately viewed by President Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur, and others as too difficult, too costly, and they decided to bypass Taiwan altogether and, of course, go for Okinawa. So in 1944, after the most successful military operation in history, certainly amphibious invasion in history, D-Day, this was viewed as very, very difficult for the United States, right?
No.
This has only gotten more difficult since then with the advent of more capable defensive systems, whether it's sonar and autonomous vehicles, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles, and many other things, right? So this is very, very difficult. And in the book, the opening scenario that you referenced really outlines one of the few ways in which I think you can do it. It takes a lot of learnings from Operation Causeway, this U.S. plan to invade the island. Although now the big difference between 1944 and today is the Taiwanese, helpfully for the Chinese, built the port of Taipei facing the strait and not far away from the capital Taipei, but right next to it. And this was literally done in the 1990s, massively expanded in 2012. So now you have this port that leads you right into the heart of the city, that is facing the strait. That if you take it, you can bring in huge numbers of ships in and unload logistics and armor and troops and everything else you need. You have two airports that were also not available back then. You have the international airport that's not too far from the port, and you have the airport right in the center of the city, near most of the government installations. That if you can do an airborne assault on those airports and load troops there, you can kind of have a pincer maneuver with troops moving from the port, from the sea's port, and from those two airfields that you've taken. And if you succeed at that, then you can bring in significant forces, airborne forces, and maritime forces onto that island. So still very, very difficult. Extremely difficult to pull off, particularly if the Taiwanese do more to prepare against this possibility. But I don't see how you could take this island without that critical infrastructure being taken. Of course, one of the learnings here is that if you actually destroy those facilities, the port and the airfields, then you can effectively prevent this invasion. The challenge is that those two, really three facilities, are the lifeline of the Taiwanese economy.
Yeah.
So this would be a presidential level decision to destroy them. And when you start looking at the vulnerability of their communications infrastructure, particularly due to cyber as well as submarine cable cuts and et cetera, you can sow enough chaos into their C2 infrastructure. Look at what the Israelis just did to Hezbollah, right? And delay any type of decision making around destruction of those facilities, which can facilitate taking them over.
And even despite the difficulties that you just said, I think it's worth noting, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the CIA director Burns did state with high confidence that she has given order to the military to be ready for this by 2027. So even despite all the difficulties that you just said, it's clearly not enough of a deterrence right now. And why November 13th, 2028?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So the CIA's intelligence indicates he's given the order to be ready. That does not mean that he's going to go in 27. For several reasons, I don't think 27 is likely to be the time of invasion. Him giving the order to be ready by 27 tells us a couple things. One, that he's really, really focused on this issue, right? This is not just a hypothetical. He's now telling the military to prepare for it. Two, that he believes he's not ready today, right? So for people that are, sometimes I get people reaching out to me saying, well, do you think this will happen the next month, with the election, or, next year? And I'm like, no, they're not ready. This is very, very difficult. And clearly they know themselves they're not ready. So it's going to take them years to get anywhere close to being ready. I'm not even sure that they'll succeed to be ready by 27. Because after all, just because you give an order to be ready doesn't mean it'll actually get done. He may be told that it's done, but whether it's done in reality is a different story entirely. He's given a lot of orders that have not come to pass. Most famously, his Made in China 2025 order, or plan that was established in 2015, was to become self-sufficient in certain industries like semiconductors and others. And we're almost in 2025, and they've basically failed on nearly every one of those initiatives. They made progress, but they did not get to self-sufficiency. 27 is an important date symbolically, right? So 27 is the year when he very likely gets reelected to yet another term as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in October and November of that year. It is also the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the PLA, of the People's Liberation Army, which got established before the establishment of the Chinese Communist state, People's Republic of China, because the PLA is actually not the military of the Chinese state. It is the military of the Chinese Communist Party. A very, very important distinction. So as soon as the Communist Party got established, they established the military arm, and this is the 100th year anniversary coming up. And imagine the symbolism of him going in front of the Chinese Party Congress,
Mm.
in 2027, in the fall of 2027, and announcing that for the first time, China has the ability at the time of their choosing to take Taiwan, and that he, Xi Jinping, is the guy responsible for getting them to that point, right? Very important symbolically, and certainly very helpful for shoring up his position and power. And then I think he's going to be looking at the next 5 years. It's a 5 year term to which he'll be elected in 27, expires in 2032, by which point he'll be 79. So unclear, at least I think for him, whether he can get one more term after that. After all, we've just witnessed what happens to leaders when they reach their 80s, and the pressure from their parties to potentially step down. Also, health concerns come into play and so forth. He doesn't seem to me, I'm not a doctor, a medical professional, but he doesn't seem like the healthiest individual in the world. There's a reason why he's called Winnie the Pooh on the Chinese internet. And I think he's going to be looking at that 5 years to really do this, establish his legacy. I think the window opens up for him in 28. 27, as I mentioned, is unlikely because they probably won't reach that goal anyway. But also it's effectively his election year, right? You don't launch a war of choice, particularly one that's this consequential, this dangerous. When you're busy shoring up your support, it's not an election in our sense of the term, and in that most of the Chinese people, of course, don't vote, but the party members do, and you still have to shore that up. Almost certainly he will get reelected, but it's not a certainty. There's a lot of grumblings about his leadership, about the economy, and so forth. So he needs to do some work to make sure that everything goes very smoothly. The last thing you want to do is be distracted by a huge war. So after he gets reelected, then in 28, I think the window does open up, assuming that they actually get ready. And you also have him being less distracted, but the Taiwanese and the US being more distracted because you have the election, the presidential legislative elections in Taiwan in January of 2028, with the inauguration of the new president potentially in May of that year. Well, inauguration either way, whether it's a new president or not, remains to be seen. You have the Los Angeles Olympics in the summer of that year, quite distracting for the United States as well. And then, of course, our own presidential election in November of 2028. So all of those things, are going to take Taiwanese attention, change in leadership, right? Anytime you have kind of lame duck administration, whether it's in Taiwan or the United States, keep people believing for the private sector early. You'll have a lot of actings. So kind of a hollowed out national security apparatus, both in Taiwan and the United States. And, after the election, November 13th is about a week, I think, out from the election. You have an opportunity for Xi to go. I'm not predicting that
Yeah,
he's going to go on that date or that month or even that year, but I do think that's kind of the opening of the window that he's going to look at, and then ultimately decide based on the readiness of his own forces, the readiness of the forces that he would confront in terms of the Taiwanese, the U.S., and others.
interesting. So you say that we're in a Cold War, and also that labels are very important. Why are we in a Cold War?
Well, I think the similarities between Cold War One, as I say, and Cold War Two, Roman numeral two, are just absolutely incredible. And in fact, this was one of the discoveries for me personally as I was writing this book, because I had assumed for a long time that this was a Cold War, but I assumed that this was a very different Cold War than the one we faced with the Soviet Union. And the more I dug in and did the research for this book, I realized, oh my God, they're almost identical, right? So first of all, let me make the case, right? The
Yeah,
dictionary definition of a Cold War, not the Cold War, but a Cold War, sort of the Oxford Dictionary, is that it's a state of political hostility between countries that is characterized by propaganda, threats, and other measures short of open warfare. Again, I would challenge anyone on this call to tell me that does not describe the U.S.-China relationship to a T.
yeah,
So hopefully we have an agreement that it's at least a Cold War. Now, why is it the Cold War? Well, if you look at the similarities between the two conflicts, the list is a mile long. We have a global competition for supremacy that's playing out in every corner of the world between the United States and China. It plays out in the technological sphere, in the cyber sphere, in economic sphere, in military sphere, diplomatic sphere, right? You have rival blocs that are being established with BRICS, and China really getting close to a lot of our adversaries, Russia, North Korea, even Iran, and us trying to build our own coalitions with Quad with India and Japan and Australia, with AUKUS with Australia and the UK, and others. You have an arms race, a conventional arms race, a nuclear arms race that's playing out with both countries. You have a space race, right? For the first time since the 1960s, the defining moment of the first Cold War, we're trying to get back to the moon, and we're trying to do it before the Chinese, right? Does that sound familiar to you? You have a scramble for military bases. We're putting a lot of effort in trying to establish military presence in the Philippines for the first time in 30 years, 32 years. Uh, Reinforced forces in Japan, even in Korea, in Australia. China is doing the same thing in Cambodia and Pakistan and Djibouti and other places. You have an economic trade war that's taking place. You have a spy war, right? The level of espionage against this country is at the highest it's ever been, far eclipsing anything we had seen during the first Cold War, in part because, of course, cyber activity. You have a technological war with semiconductor export control measures, the cars, electric vehicles issues, and solar panels and the like. You have Taiwan being the regional flashpoint that I argue in the book was West Berlin, for the first part of the Cold War. That was the point where the two superpowers, Soviet Union and the United States, now China and the United States, can go to war. You have an ideological struggle. It's not quite as acute as it was in the first Cold War, but certainly you have an authoritarianism versus democracy struggle that's playing out. And China is, and certainly Xi Jinping is, a Marxist-Leninist in the really fundamental sense of that word as well. Um, and I argue that the first Cold War began much earlier than we realized. I argue that it did not begin in 1946 or 1947, plus the end of World War II, but it actually started in 1920, when the Soviet Union started focusing on the United States and Great Britain as their two great rivals, and we completely ignored it for the next 25 years, while they were stealing our intellectual property, while they were conducting espionage against us, trying to build up their military. Similarly, this Cold War did not begin with Donald Trump's tariffs in 2018, or pick your or even Aurora in 2010. This began much earlier when they started infiltrating our companies, stealing our intellectual property, both through cyber espionage as well as non-cyber means, building up their military to take us on and to take Taiwan. After all, in the 1990s, right, the great 1990s, when we proclaimed the end of history, people forget now, but there was a third Taiwan Strait crisis when, in 1995 and 1996, the Chinese started firing missiles across the Taiwan Strait, and President Clinton sent two aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait. And we now know from declassified documents that there was concern in the White House that we would go to war with China in 1995, 1996. People completely forgot about that episode. So this has been going on for a long time. So you have all these reasons why I think the two conflicts are very similar. And the one thing that people come up with and challenge me when I give these talks is look at the economic relationship uh, that exists between China and the Soviet Union. And look, I don't know how you make a credible argument that this is not a Cold War when I've just given you a dozen similarities that are almost identical between the two periods, and you give me one on the other side of the ledger and claim that that one overrules all the others. So that doesn't really jive with me. But my other counterpoint to that is that, well, let's look at the economic relationship between the West and the Soviet Union, and how the entire economy of the Soviet Union, which was from the 1960s on running basically off oil and gas, was basically being propped up by the West, and was given, because we were buying so much of their fossil fuels, and just like we do from Russia today, and we were actually providing equipment to facilitate that the extraction of those fossil resources, without which they would not have been able to do it. We were facilitating building of pipelines that would enable Soviet Union to collect that money. And in the 1970s and 80s, we're actually not only doing that, but we're providing loans to the Warsaw Pact countries like Poland and others that would help sustain their economies, right? So we were literally financing our enemies. And of course, much of that money was going back into their military industrial base to prepare them for fighting a war with us. So we were literally arming our adversary, not unlike what we're doing now. The level of economic interdependence is much greater today. I'm not going to argue that. But it is actually going down. The trade deficit with China has gone down dramatically in the last 8 years, and it's going down further. Foreign direct investment is down 20% year over year in China. So there is partial decoupling in progress, and the two economies are getting more and more decoupled, particularly in the areas of advanced technologies. So things are changing quite rapidly.
Yeah. And speaking of economics, I have one last question about the Chinese economy, and I'll just ask you to make your answer a little bit brief, just because I want to get to some of these other questions submitted. But from my perspective, it seems like China has these massive macroeconomic headwinds. The middle income trap, population decline. I think 30% of their GDP is based off of real estate, which is in quite a bubble right now. The local government spending isn't what it used to be. If that trend continues, and I think it's fair to say that she hasn't done well with the economics of that country. Does a worsening Chinese economy increase or decrease, or none, the likelihood of an invasion of Taiwan?
I think it actually brings the time frame forward. Right
Mm,
now, we have the luxury of Xi Jinping really believing, I think he's completely wrong on this, but he believes that this century will be the Chinese century, that the US is in permanent decline, that this issue with the Chinese economy is a temporary blip that he will overcome. I think he's totally wrong on this, but he believes it. And as long as he thinks that time is on his side, we can potentially keep pushing this timeline further and further out, right? We want him to wake up every single day and basically say, today is not the day
mm,
to invade Taiwan. Tomorrow might be, but today is not the day. Uh, the worse that the economy gets, and if he gets convinced that his time is slipping and that maybe he will never catch up to the United States, after all, our economy is 25% greater than his, and if his is already growing at 4 to 5% a year, potentially even lower, not too far off from our growth rates, that means he'll never catch up with us on nominal terms. That might make him more likely to go sooner rather than later, right? Because the gap will only grow, particularly if the economic situation gets much, much worse.
yeah.
So I think it creates a danger. And by the way, the other problem is that people say, oh, the economy will be terrible, so they will not be able to spend as much money on their military. Well, that's not the case. Despite their economic challenges, their defense spending is soaring, and their defense industry is on a wartime footing. So in autocratic regimes, you can allocate much more of the spending than you can in democratic societies on the things you think matter, such as national security, defense, etc. After all, look at Russia. Today, Russia is spending 40% of its federal budgets on security and defense. 40%, right? Uh, North Korea, right? A basket case of an economy, yet has nuclear weapons, has ballistic missiles, supplying Russia with missiles and artillery shells, right? So just because you have an economy that's not doing so well does not mean that this will translate into a weaker military. Potentially quite the opposite for authoritarian countries. So I think it makes them more dangerous.
Interesting. Thanks, Dimitri. So I'll go to the Q&As that we have here. So the first one, what conclusions is she likely drawing from the extent and pace of US and Western support for Ukraine?
Well, the obvious one might be that, the West and the United States is fickle. They don't like long wars, and eventually they get tired of it and decide to abandon their allies. He may not even need Ukraine for that. He can look at Afghanistan. He could look at Vietnam. He could look at Iraq. Right? We have a long history of doing that. The problem with that argument, though, is that he cannot afford a long war either. Right? If he is fighting a 3-year war with the United States over Taiwan, this is a disaster for him, right? Because his economy is going to be absolutely crippled. He'll potentially be under an embargo, trade embargo, his ability to produce munitions and many other things will be reduced to naught. So he needs us to be quick and rapid, and hopefully without getting the United States into the war. So I'm not sure that the Ukrainian lessons have a great applicability for him with regards to Taiwan. And one could say also, well, he will look at the challenges that Russia has had in Ukraine and say wars are difficult. Maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe, but the Chinese always have a very dismissive view of the Russians. They think they're drunkards. They think they're incompetent. They think they're beneath them. They actually have a nickname for them in Mandarin that translates to the hairy ones. So just because Putin is screwing up in Ukraine, I don't think at all means that she is going to assume that he's going to screw up in Taiwan. And land war is very different from amphibious invasions. So will he maybe ask more questions about force readiness? Likely, but will it fundamentally alter his outlook? I don't think so. And the other thing he can be learning is that the United States and its allies will not fight a nuclear power, right? Because we're not, even though we're providing weapons and financial support to Ukraine, we're not sending troops. In fact, President Biden ruled that out before the conflict even began. So if the United States is not fighting for Taiwan, this becomes much more doable because the Taiwanese state of readiness is really not where it needs to be.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, next user question. We've heard that if my company writes a brief or advisory related to China and Taiwan, it could anger China and cause them to be angry with our company. Do you have further info on how legitimate this concern is and how to avoid it if possible?
Well, I think it all depends on whether that brief is public or not. I think lots of companies that I work with have done private assessments, private war games on potential conflict and so forth. And even if you get hacked and that leaks out, I don't think there'll be any repercussions for the company. I certainly haven't seen any. If you start talking about it publicly, that might be another issue altogether. But right now, they're so paranoid about companies exiting the market that it actually presents a lot of opportunities to Western businesses. Because I'll tell you a quick story. One company I know, major tech company, uh, announced global layoffs quite recently, impacting every region of the world. And they got calls from multiple Chinese ministries asking them if they're pulling out of China,
Oh,
right? They just focused on the Chinese layoffs, right? So they're absolutely paranoid about foreign companies leaving the market. So this actually presents, I think, a lot of leverage for companies to get better deals and be a little more freer in how they operate in China.
that's interesting. Um, all right. So, what are the risks of pulling U.S. military assets from Indo-Pacific region to calm down Middle East crisis? Does it erode U.S. deterrence against CCP in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, again, I don't think that he's likely to invade anytime soon. This is not, to pull off an operation like this, it's not like, you give the order to go and, next week the invasion fleet disembarks, right? This is many, many months of preparations, mobilizations, building barracks in the forts to house hundreds of thousands of forces, logistics that you need to accumulate, and so forth, right? So this is, hopefully our movement of an aircraft carrier from the region where we don't have one right now to the Middle East is a temporary one, and I don't think it's going to have significant impact on the security of the Indo-Pacific. Our expansion of missile arsenals, interceptors that we just expanded with this latest salvo against Israel from Iran is a problem because our stockpiles are not deep. And this is one of the things we really have to focus on. I talk about this in the book a lot. Our defense industrial base needs to be rebuilt. We need to focus on quantities, not just qualities of weapon systems. We need to be able to manufacture them in mass. And that's something that we have really lost focus on in the last 30, 40 years.
Thanks. All right. Really quick, and then I'll end it. If you were asked by the next president to be an advisor to China and you agreed, what would be your first
In
piece?
China or on China?
To be an advisor on China. There we
Okay,
go.
okay.
Thank you. What would be your first piece of advice to the president in order to steer the U.S. away from the conflict with China?
Look, I would say acknowledge that we're in a Cold War and do so publicly. Look, the Chinese already believe that we're in a Cold War. They talk about this all the time. They think that the United States is trying to contain them, which, by the way, we are. They're absolutely right about that. So the only people that you are actually deluding by not using that term, Biden says we don't want to be in a Cold War with China. Well, if someone is punching you in a bar,
Yeah.
you either surrender or you're in a fight. You can proclaim all you want that you don't want to be in a fight, but unless you want to surrender, you're in a fight. And this is what's going on now with China. And you have to get the American people to support taking pretty significant measures that would be detrimental to us economically in some ways, to really make sure that we deter this conflict. And you have to make this a priority. So that does mean more tariffs on some Chinese goods, more export controls on advanced technologies, particularly semiconductor manufacturing equipment and some others, to restrict Chinese ability to produce it on their own, to achieve independence in some of these areas. It doesn't mean spending more on some of the defense uh, um, uh, things that munitions that we're going to need for this conflict, right? So you have to build support. You can't just proclaim that we're going to do this without explaining to the public why you're doing this. And neither the Biden administration nor I think even the Trump administration had really done that. And you have to start with a premise of what is this geopolitical conflict that we're in, and then articulate what is the vision for victory and how do we get there. And everything else flows from there. The tactical things that you need to get done are not hard, right? And I talk about many of them in the book. It's about how do you find the political will to actually do them. And look, as I say in the book, this is doable. I believe that we're in a Cold War with China, conflicts very similar to the first Cold War. But the difference between China and the Soviet Union is that China is actually much, much weaker in
Mm.
almost every respect except the economy than the Soviet Union. Its military is weaker. It does not have the alliances that the Soviet Union did. It does not have the Warsaw Pact. It does not have the landmass. It does not have the global fleet that the Soviet Union had, submarines anywhere near to the quality that the Soviet Union and even Russia have, right? So on almost every level, it's a weaker country. We beat them, we can beat China. We just need the political will to do so.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely took from your book is even though it is a kind of a bleak future, potential future that you're spelling out, the book is optimistic and it kind of gives you a smile after you read it because you believe in the solving of this problem. So um, we have 1 minute left, so I will end the way that you ended the book, saying "Sinai deterrende sunt," which means China must be deterred. For anyone that wants more context around that, please buy the book. For everyone here, thank you all for attending the webinar. We appreciate your time. Within the next 24 hours, you all get 2 emails, a link to the webinar recording, additional resources to support today's discussion. And then also by attending, you're entered into a raffle, chance to win one of 15 copies of the book. So we will be in touch if you are a winner. And Dmitri, thank you so much. Really appreciate everything that you're doing. And yeah, huge thanks.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Flashpoint. Really appreciate it.